everybody. Thank you so much for the warm welcome here in Oslo. It's my first time here, and it is genuinely an honor. Everyone has been so welcoming, and every time I get to travel outside of the United States, I am blown away by just the power of communication, not just verbal, but physical, connecting with people in other cultures. And as was mentioned today, I was asked to talk about the future of voice design. And you've heard other speakers mentioning how important this is, how this is the next frontier in user experience design. And I didn't want to come here and give you a future-telling example full of blind optimism. Instead, I want to give you a roadmap and hopefully inspire you to consider how your skills and your contributions can help us get to the next generation of voice interfaces.
Our industry has become addicted to impact. We use that word a lot. I do too. We've heard it tons of times in our presentations. But impact isn't positive or negative. It doesn't specify. And I have even more problem with the term disruption. I think there were a couple of folks who mentioned this, but disruption is not a desirable goal. Disruption is an event, it's not an outcome. And as we heard yesterday with Josh's talk, we want to focus on outcomes. As our adventures become greater, they become more dangerous.
But one thing I want to remind us of is that voice user interfaces are the oldest new idea that we've encountered as an industry. Speech recognition has been in our imaginations for a long time, but it's actually been a reality in a small form since the 1950s. It's hard to believe. But the problem was technology couldn't keep up with the enormity of human speech. So we're only just getting to the point where we can really expand our horizons and build something that's forgiving enough to speak to it as if it was another human. So humans have developed the art of conversation for thousands of years. It's one of the first skills we learn as human beings, and if we're lucky enough to get into old age, it's one of the last skills we lose. Now, this means that we can build on a lot of powerful muscle memory and a powerful built-in specializations that we built into the brain through evolution over the years. But it also means that interacting with devices, with our voices, is fundamentally different than using a mouse or a keyboard. At a cognitive level, we process our conversations with devices differently than we do our interactions with graphical interfaces. Voice user interfaces leverage this cognitive optimization to improve lives. So the first opportunity I want to talk about is the inherent bias intrinsic to today's voice user experiences. I think of all the points, this one will ring most true to Microsoft folks who are indoctrinated on the importance of accessibility and inclusiveness. But the limited training data available when most of these products were launched, especially in the culture of secrecy around the Alexa launch, for example, and the affluent user base of most of these technologies, which are being marketed as Bluetooth speakers, essentially. They're not necessities, they are luxuries. These factors combine to create a risk of excluding underrepresented groups. And it's not that Alexa or Google Assistant is intentionally disregarding us. It's that partially it's physics, it's harder to hear higher pitch rates, and partially it's an artificial intelligence problem. The pool of training data doesn't match the makeup of our population. So when I speak to my Xbox, for example, if I say Xbox login as Cheryl, it usually just stares at me. And then I have to drop my voice to the 80-year-old smoker level. Alexa, sign in as Cheryl. And then it hears me, and it's fine. And what this leads to is a bias spiral. You start with biased training data, and you release a product based on that biased training data. When it goes out into the market, that leads to poor accuracy for those excluded groups. They use the device, and because voice experiences speak to our core, it is deeply frustrating and sometimes alienating when the device doesn't recognize you properly. That leads to high attrition by excluded groups, and suddenly the training data being fed back into the device doesn't include those underrepresented groups in the first place. We must find a way to break the bias spiral and make the future of voice UI viable for all. And this is going to take a concerted effort. This will take designers reaching out and asking, Is our algorithm unbiased? Where are our weaknesses? How can we make this better? In some cases, it will mean third parties building their own independent solutions. It might mean open source voice recognition. But I challenge us as a group to find a way to continue to find a way to break that bias spiral.
So build for the worst case. Your hardware and sensors will fail. Your system can cause real harm. Your training data is probably biased because humans are biased. There are a ton of things that can and will go wrong. Not all of them may impact your customers in a tremendous way, but we have to consider these possibilities now that we're operating at scale. Now that it's not just a couple dozen customers or a couple thousand customers, but large swaths of the population, we owe it to our customers to think about these things up front.
And it's important to note that you can't avoid an iceberg you can't see. We knew this was a crazy idea, and we knew that there were huge technical and social problems and challenges that could potentially derail the project. The important note is that our deliverables early on highlighted the problems rather than obscuring them. We had to embrace what we knew could fail the project to build trust with our stakeholders and to make sure we had the right conversations early on. If I just come to you and I present a storyboard of someone who's happily managing their wardrobe and there are no problems at all because they're totally happy to have a camera in their bedroom, I'm not embracing the true reality of the situation. And that means I'm also not having the tough conversations I need to have with people who may have better ideas about how to solve that problem. Stakeholders, this is the perception of how a fashion-engaged person's closet looks. I hear some giggles. And I believe that if I surveyed folks here, many of us don't actually have closets that look like that. But if to an outside observer, this fashion magazine picture is believed to be true. Reality is far less polished. We actually found that the more fashion-engaged someone was, the more likely their closet was to look like this, because they're trying things on, they're throwing them around. And you look, if somebody coming to your project thinks this is reality, a project that helps you manage your wardrobe is silly. You could just walk up and see it. But reality in the home was much different. And as it turned out in this case, we were onto something. Once you've found your truth, mind the narrative gap. As you tell your story over and over again, your bias will inject itself into the story. You'll misinterpret pieces of anecdote, things that people said. Continue to revisit that truth over the course of the project. And wherever possible, let that truth speak for you. If you can share the ethnography results or the videos with your team members, do that. Don't speak for your customers, let them speak for themselves, and reconnect yourself to that truth, because it's amazing how in the heat of the moment when things get chaotic, how you can misinterpret what you originally heard. For woe awaits the teams that never asked if they should. This is the Juicero. It was a product that launched in the United States last year for $700. And its purpose was to squeeze juice packages. When the product shipped, customers who purchased the juice packages found that they could just as effectively squeeze the packets with their bare hands as they could with the $700 device. Needless to say, that product is no longer being sold. And they may have started from a valid customer truth, but over the process, they did not mind the narrative gap, and they thought the important part was this bespoke piece of hardware. Their customers just wanted to be healthy. That hardware wasn't actually helping them be healthy. It wasn't solving the core problem.
More impact, more people we affect, bigger products, bring more edge cases. Bring more exceptions that we weren't optimizing for when we thought about the happy path. Disruption is an event. It's not enough to say, oh, we disrupted the hotel market. There's a lot of problems that Airbnb brought to the hotel market. We need to be conscious of the outcome.
Loop. So, running out of time. So, I want to leave you with something, a few thoughts about what makes for a successful broadcast community based on my observations. Certain there's more science out there, but just from being on the front lines. First one, we haven't talked about so far. A clearly stated code of conduct. It sounds simple, and this doesn't have to be complicated. It can be 3 or 4 bullet points about what is not allowed and what is allowed or expected in the community. We don't allow bullying. We do expect inclusivity. All people are welcome here. This gives your panel of moderators dedicated to enforcing those community standards clear and transparent ways of enforcing. And the Twitch platform also gives them tools for doing that. But if you just put mods out there without a clear code of conduct, things get messy quickly. So you need both of these things, people monitoring the system in real time, but people who are empowered with a clear set of guidelines. You also need some way for your community to express themselves, both a shared identity as part of the community, but also individuality, whether that's contributing to a wikia or contributing fan art. It doesn't mean that everyone will do it, but anyone who does do it is feeding energy into the community and validating everyone's participation in the community. So finding ways to celebrate those contributions, they're a great gift.
So how do we cope with the world obsessed with disruption, where our products are massive and affect millions of people in some cases? This is where optipessimism comes in. This is a frame of thinking I had to adopt for myself when I found myself working on these large projects, like Windows Automotive. Designing an automotive interface is a life or death situation. If you get that interface wrong and someone gets a text at the wrong moment while they're on the road, someone's life is at stake. And I needed to change the way I thought about my work. So I'm going to give you 4 rules, 4 guidelines for questions, changes to your process that will help you shift your thinking so that you can incorporate edge cases into your work and embrace them.
Some of which never get used again. It's heartbreaking in a way. And in many cases, problems like this can be stopped before they start if we ask tough questions of ourselves and our users, rather than just asking our most vocal supporters what they might want. Another question to ask yourself is, what happens if our success is not the same thing as success for our customers? If we're too successful, how could customers be harmed? We start to talk about addiction to mobile devices. We start to talk about the ways our devices are transforming people's lives. Addiction, stress, broken relationships. If you're working on a social media site, things like Facebook are tearing families apart.
Now, I mentioned up front, we're going to talk about 3 techniques, and the first one we're going to talk about is planning with a scenario focus. So calling out risk, opportunity, and overlap while keeping the player at the center. One of the unique things about the Game Pass project was that UX design was engaged during the business development portion of the process. And so I was called in May of 2022, before we signed the deal, at the request of leadership, to help define the core UX needed for a successful launch, what a few of us dubbed the minimum lovable product. So my challenge was to broaden what was pretty much a largely technical focused discussion, like what features are we going to support for Microsoft, to include an end-to-end player-focused lens that helped us answer questions appropriate to the business development stage of the process. But what questions were those? I sort of grouped these into 4 categories. One of them was, where were the areas of greatest risk? Calling out proactively areas of the player journey with many back-end calls, lots of complex logic, input transitions, or likely errors. I wrote a book a couple years ago called Design Beyond Devices, creating cross-device, multimodal cross-device experiences. And I talk a lot about transitions, because transitions in many ways are where our experiences go to die. As designers, as engineers, we're trained to focus on a single device experience, but it's where things move between them that things are easily forgotten.
Let's invoke the song of simpler days, back when camera phones were first on the market, for those of you who remember that. We often sort of poked our friends when they told us about great stories and said, pics or it didn't happen. If you hadn't taken photos of a great event, it might as well have just been a story. But and many of us have pictures that came during a notable event, once everything had sort of gone into motion. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't have very many pictures anymore because the pandemic doesn't make very many things photogenic. So I'm glad I have those pictures now. But On most modern projects, it's not enough to wait for the right moment to take stock of our work or to take a photo of that work. By then, it's possible that the events that our work may cause harm, measurable harm to the people who are consuming our work or even surrounding our work, who aren't even our customers. So how do we evaluate a project before it's happened? We're not psychic, or maybe some of us think we are, but probably we're all just human trying to do the right thing. So I'm here to tell you that we should take pics or it shouldn't happen. PICS is an easy shorthand for 4 lenses through which you should view your early design and product ideas. It's easy to remember, and each of the letters in the acronym gives you a framework that you can remember, and through that you can ask yourself some challenge questions. PICS stands for problem, inclusion, change, and system. 4 lenses we want to use to deconstruct ideas we have to make sure that we're minimizing the potential for harm as much as possible. And sometimes we don't want to investigate the idea at all, but in many cases, there's things we can do to account for the potential harm up front and make our ideas stronger in the process.
So let's talk about the 6 classic motivators of play. These are timeless. They've been around since we had Ataris and since we were playing games in Egypt with random stones. Well, probably. I don't know if that was very immersive, but so fun, mastery, competition, immersion, meditation, and comfort. But broadband and smartphones further changed what constitutes good gaming. Players have new expectations forged by highly responsive, constantly updated, massively multiplayer worlds constantly at the ready in the palm of their hands. And so we have some new motivators of play that are shifting the landscape: self-expression, companionship, and education. All 3 of these motivators rely on broad scale of either player base or data that really wasn't possible 15 years ago, except in very rare circumstances. And, self-expression is pictured here as Minecraft, companionship example here is squads on Fortnite, and education example here is Duolingo, but there are so many other examples. But how much has really changed? I mean, aren't players still seeking competitive, mastery-driven experiences? When I started putting all these theories together, I wanted to challenge myself, so I started looking for research to see whether or not I was on the right track. And you might be surprised. According to Fandom's Inside Gaming 2024 study of 5,000 gamers globally, cross-referenced across their extensive platform data, the top reasons why people self-reported gaming, meditation and comfort, or unwinding and stress relief, are the top reported reason, 54%. Big in an overwhelmingly stressful world, which explains why we have so many screw puzzles and match 3 games and merge games. And notably, social connection and community is 39%, but competition is 18%. It's one of the lowest reported motivators here. And this is players describing their own motivation. Meanwhile, self-expression is shooting up the charts. And so why so many PvP games if only 18% of players want them? It seems like we as a game industry aren't necessarily in sync with today's player needs.
Optipessimism does take effort. They spent a lot of time and money developing these ballot boxes, but not only did the worst case happen and they were prepared, but their preparedness turned into a product opportunity. Now there are states all across the United States who want that ballot box because they've seen what it can do. So in many cases, optipessimistic thinking takes time and effort, but it may make your product more desirable in the end, because shit happens. But how do you explore worst case scenarios before they happen? I could have asked, what should we do if we encounter a dangerous animal? It's, one of the many questions I could have asked prior to heading out on that safari. I should have known that shit happens. Name your nightmares so you can face them head on. I know it doesn't feel good to think about all the things that could go wrong, and in many cases you feel like you're being defeatist, but pessimism can be a good thing. So name those nightmares and embrace them. Once you named Voldemort, you can address him, you can deal with him.
But conversation also requires trust. It's an exchange, and if you start looking at conversational theory and research, it keeps coming back to trust and the elements of time. Humans build trust over time. But all of your voice assistants today basically have amnesia. They can remember the fact that you mentioned a city for maybe 10 seconds, and then that flits out into the ether, never to be remembered again. We certainly don't remember conversations later. We don't come back a month later and remember the context of a conversation. And in some ways, this is to simplify things, but we're not building trust with these assistants. Maybe we're anthropomorphizing them and projecting trust in there, but it's not the same way that our friendships work with other human beings. But trust is a double-edged sword, and I don't want to run around saying that that's necessarily the end-all, be-all for your user interfaces. Trust is very powerful, and it cuts both ways. When you trust something, you are vulnerable. And the more vulnerable you are, the worse your emotional reaction will be if you are betrayed, if that trust is broken. And that emotional connection to speech, we need to remember that. As designers, we are the champions of human behavior, of cognitive psychology, and of emotion. And we need to respect the fact that if customers do place trust in our assistants, they're processing speech in different parts of their brain. The trust makes them vulnerable. They will have emotional reactions to the work that you are putting out there. And that's why it's so hurtful when one of these systems doesn't respond. It's a very vulnerable place. But on the other end, trust can build companionship. And this really is an opportunity. And I'm not proposing that we replace all human contact, but we are the lucky ones here in this room. We are surrounded by a community. Many of us are affluent, and we have people we can go to. We are still healthy. There are many in this world who do not have those blessings, whether it's Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, whether it's existing on the autistic spectrum and finding it super burdensome to figure out somebody's emotions in the moment, or whether it's traditional social anxiety. There are many people who don't have ready access to companionship. And we can offer some form of comfort for those folks. And for physical disabilities, to people who can't leave the house. We think of an aging population and what we could do for folks who are cut off, who had the misfortune to pass before their children. And our health system is taxed. There are ways that we can help bridge the gap and accentuate the humanity of people who are cut off. And the other thing that differentiates these environments, these communities, is the sense of immediacy. It's why sports are popular. It's the gathering around the campfire, why that's a special moment. We, in a specific moment in time, or within a few hours of a moment of time, shared an experience. It is shared context. It builds trust over time. This immediacy, it gives us something that's common, maybe when we have nothing else in common. And that rallying point is very important. Another important point I want to make is that Dunbar's number is magic, around 150 people, that little guideline for how many folks we can manage in our heads. My experience on Twitch has given me a theory that this is modal, that we can switch back and forth, that we can engage wholeheartedly with the digital community of 150, just as we do with a real-life community of 150. So it's an interesting challenge to designers working on larger scale communities. Can you support the emergence of smaller pods to keep your larger community healthy? It's worth investigating.
Use your storytelling skills to bring the voice of your customer to difficult conversations. I think storyboards are more useful to tell you what not to do than they are to tell you what to do. Instead of just showing this magic pixie dust world where everything works, point out the places where there's friction. Point out the places where there's difficulty, like you couldn't position the camera correctly, there wasn't a plug nearby. By calling out the difficulties up front, you have important conversations before it's too late.
On this particular project, we had some icebergs around installation, security, and our sensors. And so in my very first storyboards for the product, when we were trying to envision what this looked like, one of the challenges we knew we were facing was the plug. We wanted this to be a daily use product. People tend to get dressed on a daily basis. But if it was a battery-operated product, you'd have to go remove it from its mount and plug it in. And then we figured it was not too much of a cognitive leap to assume that people would stop using the product once it had been removed from its original location. And so the early storyboards tried to draw attention to these problems. Like, there's a plug attached to a mirror here. And in fact, not a lot of closets have plugs. We knew this would cause problems, and we wanted to discuss that with our stakeholders. If the product couldn't succeed in spite of this problem, then it didn't deserve to move on. And similarly, calling attention to the fact that you can't just magically stick the camera to the wall and have it work. There's a calibration portion. And I'll also make a side note on these storyboards. We moved agile, in a very agile fashion. We were moving aggressively. And so if these are not Pixar-level quality, it's more important to tell a quality story than it is to create bespoke art. And more than what's being shown here, it's the story that's being told, which parts of our customer's experience we chose to show. So if you find yourself in one of these experiences, if you find yourself hypothetically locked in a closet with a product and you can't talk to anybody and you're on your own, I imagine you have all the skills you need to tell your customer's story and provide context, even if this is not your strength.
So be ready to adapt in the moment. Ask yourself, what signals might we watch for that our product is not working as intended? Where is the highest risk? And where might our awareness gaps be? Where does our team lack the appropriate diversity to understand the impact to disadvantaged folks? What's our rollout plan? Are we doing it gradually? Do we have a way to pause? And do we have fail-safes in place for device failure or other problems in the field? And this is a fun project management challenge, but are we committing to revisiting the product with resources to make changes later? How many of you have ever had a product that went back after launch and fixed things within the first month? I don't know if I see any hands. This is a long road, but we should start having these conversations too. And I'll never know why the elephant ran in the other direction after we occupied the same space. I have theories. I'm very pale. He may have thought I was a ghost. We'll never know. But I am thankful that the elephant ran in the opposite direction. And then the story ends easily, as you do, sitting in the middle of a field, watching dung beetles and talking about marriage traditions, and reflecting on how we got there. Hiking was an optimistic act, but I should have been more pessimistic during the journey. There were ways to avoid the situation or be more prepared, but I was too optimistic thinking things would be fine. And they worked out, but that was not a guarantee. So I challenge you to adopt optipessimism in your process. This does not mean you need to be pessimistic all the time. I absolutely want you to embrace your optimistic desire for a better world. That's why we're all here. We just need to make sure that unchecked optimism doesn't blind us to the real dangers working in the field. There's dung to be found if you look. The elephants in the room require us to confront the dangers ahead. Optipessimism turns edge cases into safety and success. Elephant plus poop equals running, but elephant plus poop plus asking good questions means ideas about how to deal with the situation better or avoid it entirely. So on your next adventure, get optipessimistic. Consider the human context, design for the best case, build for the worst case, and be ready to adapt in the moment.